Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into political commentator James Lindsay's breakdown of fascism. Now, obviously, it's an incredibly charged topic, but our goal here is simply to impartially trace the historical origins he lays out, and then examine exactly how he applies those frameworks to modern political and economic systems.
Look, if you've spent even 5 minutes on social media lately, you know exactly what Lindsay is talking about here. People throw this word around everywhere. It's used willy-nilly to label practically anyone with an opposing viewpoint. From big public figures to everyday folks in the comments section, the label gets applied so broadly that it seems to cover almost everyone at one point or another.
So, it really makes you wonder, what actually is the historical definition of this highly charged word? Once you strip away the everyday political mudslinging, what are the actual structural and philosophical roots that define it?
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with how the word acts as a thought-terminating cliché, move into Mussolini's state as religion, check out Hitler's racial and structural pivot, look at China's state corporatism, and finally, dive into the modern stakeholder capitalism comparison.
All right, Section 1, a thought-terminating cliché.
Lindsay actually argues that the word has completely lost its historical meaning. Nowadays, it's basically used as a strategic, thought-terminating cliché. It's a linguistic trick, right? It's designed to just instantly shut people up, completely demonize opponents so nobody listens to them, and in the absolute worst-case scenarios, even justify street violence against whoever gets slapped with the label.
Moving right along to Section 2, Mussolini's state as religion.
To really understand the roots of this ideology, Lindsay takes us all the way back to Benito Mussolini. Now, fun fact, Mussolini originally started out as a Marxist. But as World War I kicked off, he had a realization. He saw that people cared way more about their national identity than any sort of international class solidarity. So he totally ditched Marxism's internationalism. Instead, he pivoted hard into a national socialism that put the collective identity of the nation above literally everything else. He was basically shaping a totalitarian religion where the state operates as God.
And here's where Lindsay highlights this incredibly chilling biological metaphor Mussolini used. He literally viewed society as one giant living organism. The state, that's the nervous system pulling the strings. The institutions are the organs. And you, the individual, you're just a tiny little cell. Your entire purpose in life is to serve the state. And if you're a cell that decides, not to do what you're told, well, you're treated like a cancer and systematically removed.
Now, it's crucial to understand this wasn't just some thuggish power grab. It was deeply, deeply tied to early 20th century modernism. This was a rampantly progressive utopian project trying to socially engineer a perfect future. To pull that off, society had to be rigidly organized. So classical liberalism, the idea of individual liberty, was thrown completely out the window. They honestly viewed individualism as a poison to the national body.
Which brings us to Section 3. Hitler's racial and structural pivot.
So, Adolf Hitler borrowed heavily from Mussolini's playbook, but he actually thought the Italian model lacked a solid foundation. His solution? He injected a hardcore racial worldview, the Völkisch ideology, into the mix. If you look at the timeline, from the Nazi Party's founding in 1920 right through his writings in 1924, Hitler made race, specifically the German Volk, the absolute center of this collective identity. This fundamentally changed the Italian model.
Also, Hitler wasn't really into Mussolini's whole organic body metaphor. Instead, he relied on this rigid, highly militarized Prussian structure called the Führerprinzip, or leader principle. Picture a perfect, unyielding pyramid. If you're the leader at the top, you take absolute responsibility for everyone below you. But in exchange, they owe you absolute, unquestioning submission.
And it all really crystallized in 1937 with the Nazi Shareholder Act. This piece of legislation cemented the rule that corporations had to serve the state first, period. Now, the state didn't technically own the businesses, but practically speaking, they became organs of the government. They were forced to answer to state officials placed right on their boards to make sure they were producing exactly what the nation needed for rearmament.
Let's jump forward to Section 4, China's state corporatism.
According to Lindsay, after Mao, the Chinese Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping ran into a massive problem of production. Their fix? They kept their ultimate communist goals, but they adopted production mechanisms that are, and this is wild, perfectly parallel to that 1937 state corporatism we just talked about. Today, Chinese corporations are totally allowed to make a profit, sure, but they absolutely must serve the state's interests first, all while the party keeps totalitarian control over everyday life.
Lindsay points to a 2014 Chinese government document that really hits the nail on the head here.
It outright says their social credit system is necessary to make ideal socialists. So they aren't just using this system for basic crowd control. They are using real-time operant conditioning to actively program their citizens into perfectly serving the state's ideological vision.
And finally, Section 5, the stakeholder capitalism comparison.
All right, this brings us to arguably the most controversial part of Lindsay's analysis, raising a highly provocative question. Does a version of this historical system actively exist inside Western corporations today? Lindsay argues that yes, the structural mechanisms are absolutely there. They're just operating under a different brand name. He draws a direct parallel to the modern push for stakeholder capitalism. You know, traditional shareholder capitalism has a pretty narrow defined duty. Just deliver business value and returns to the owners. But stakeholder capitalism, that claims a duty to literally everyone affected by the company. And Lindsay argues this wide-open mandate creates the perfect backdoor to force sweeping social ideologies right into corporate governance.
By comparing these historical models to the modern West, Lindsay suggests the stakeholder model effectively forces companies to answer to ideological expert councils. We see this in uniform DEI statements and identical corporate policies popping up across totally different industries. He argues this is a mirror image of that 1937 corporatist structure. The focus shifts away from the actual owners, and suddenly corporations are compelled to serve the ideological demands of a central coordinating elite.
So, to wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with this one final crucial thought. Based on these claims, if historical models of state corporatism are genuinely just being rebranded as modern corporate responsibility, who ultimately holds the power in a stakeholder society? Who gets to decide what's best for the stakeholders, and who is really holding the reins? It is absolutely a question worth asking as we navigate this wild intersection of business, ideology, and power. Thanks for joining us for today's explainer.